It is a little past 10, and for the sake of staying on schedule, we'll call this meeting to order. And this is the House Study Committee on Annexation, De-annexation, and Incorporation, which was defined under House Resolution 743. I am Representative Jan Tankersley from House District 160. I'm the chair of the Intergovernmental Coordination Committee and chair of the study committee. I do want to take this opportunity to thank committee members, Legislative Council, the House research staff, all the presenters, and concerned citizens for their dedication and commitment to making this House Study Committee a conduit for the exchange of ideas and information as we've studied the conditions and the difficulties we've all experienced with annexation, de-annexation, and incorporation of municipalities. The focus on today's meeting will remain on ways to assist the work of the Georgia General Assembly in achieving the goals of serving the citizens of Georgia. After reviewing our last meeting on the incorporation process, I am very pleased with the discussions and the recommendations that have taken place. Citizens on both sides of the issue made their voices heard by way of emails, phone calls, and testimony. Today, this committee will focus on the process for the creation of city boundary lines by Mrs. Gina Wright from the Legislative and Congressional Reapportionment Office. We also have the Georgia Municipal Association and the Association of County Commissioners of Georgia for summary statements or other questions or comments from the committee. Finally, public comments will be allowed today at the end of the meeting, where we will have members from the Fulton County Commission for a presentation and time for anyone else who wishes to speak today. If you have not signed up, please do so now. We have a sign-up sheet at the podium. Everyone still has the opportunity to submit more detailed comments by way of email to committee members for consideration. Please do remember that this committee will not tolerate personal attacks, threats, or other disruptive behavior, and I'm happy to report we've had none of that in these study meetings. If you do feel the need to exhibit such behavior, though, you will be asked to leave. At this time, I would remind you to please turn off your cell phones and electronic devices. And I would just like to say that overall, my my role as chair of the Intergovernmental Coordination Committee is to ensure that all technical requirements are met for the local legislation assigned to my committee by the Speaker of the House. One technical requirement is certification from the Office of Reapportionment for any local legislation dealing with redistricting. The office uses data provided to the state of Georgia by the U.S. Census Bureau for this purpose. Ms. Gina Wright, Executive Director for the Legislative and Congressional Reapportionment Office, will now discuss the process to the committee. Please keep in mind this is an opportunity for the appointed study committee to review any issues or recommendations from Mrs. Wright. Gina, if you would address the committee.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee. Glad to be here today to discuss my office with you, what we do, and how we are a part of this process as far as incorporations are concerned. I'd like to start with just giving you a little bit of a description of our office and the history of our office, so you would understand kind of where we are coming from and what it is that we do in specific. I know that question has come up a little bit. The Legislative and Congressional Reapportionment Office was established in 1971 by former Speaker Tom Murphy under a contract to the University of Georgia. The purpose of the office was to provide nonpartisan technical assistance to the General Assembly following each decennial census, with the redrawing of its U.S. congressional districts, as well as the State Senate and the State House districts. More recently, in 2012, our office was the contract with UGA was ended, and our office was shifted underneath the General Assembly in its entirety and made a joint office of the General Assembly, which is what we are presently. Through those years, from 1971 forward, as technology improved and the process of redrawing districts changed, the reapportionment office, at that time under the direction of Linda Meggers, helped to pioneer the use of geographic information system technology for redistricting. We acquired a software program called Maptitude for redistricting, which was about in the late 1990s. We got that software, and it was a very new program at the time. Georgia was instrumental in testing out this program, and because we were so active in it and so supportive of the software at the time, other states also have gone to using that software program now for their redistricting as well. And even local governments have acquired it. Even counties within Georgia also have that program now to use for their redrawing and other purposes that they use. To explain a little bit of what GIS is, GIS means that databases and information are basically attached to the geographic features. So you kind of have a smart map. It's not just looking at a map that you move around and see the streets, but there is actually data underlying that. So as you manipulate the map, you also are manipulating the data. Using GIS and Maptitude has become an essential part of what we do in our office, not only for redistricting at the state and the local level, but also in working with counties as they adjust their voting precinct boundaries. We do a lot of that with all 159 counties. We create reports and custom maps for various state agencies, even outside of the General Assembly. And even now in the process of incorporating municipalities, we've been very involved in that. Since 2005, as you know, the General Assembly has adopted legislation enabling 10 different areas to determine if they wanted to form a new municipality. Throughout the legislative process, with each of those incorporations, the Reapportionment Office provided assistance to the members of the General Assembly and the organizers of the proposed cities, usually with sponsorship from whatever member was going to be working with them. In, the first 8 city bills that were presented happened over an 8-year time frame. You have a spreadsheet chart in front of you that kind of gives you the dates of those particular city bills and the effective dates. You can see when those were to go into effect. That chart also shows you the committee that the bill was assigned to and a little bit of the description of how the boundaries were drawn, and I'll go over those types in just a moment. In the last 2 years, though, there have been 6 incorporation bills that were presented. So you had 8 over an 8-year span, and then in the last 2 you've had 6. So you see the frequency has jumped quite a bit. So to effectively vet those proposals, I'm going to give you a little bit more information so you can understand exactly what we do as a part of that process. For most of the areas that have considered cityhood, there's been a defined notion of what should be in the city and what should not. The organizers come to us and they have a great idea of what they think they're looking at in terms of the area they want to include. So we work with them using our software to compile a grouping of that area together that hopefully meets what they are looking for. To draft legislation in the charter for the new city, there has to be an official designation of the boundaries for the corporate limits, and if they're going to include districts, there has to be an official description of those as well. In most of these instances, my office has been able to provide that description of the boundaries as they want them to be. We're able to use our software, which even though it's geared towards redistricting primarily, but we can also create those groupings of blocks as one large group to create a district description for the corporate limits as well. In only 3 of the previous created cities that have been approved by the General Assembly were we not able to describe exactly what they wanted with the block description that we use. In those instances, a third-party group was hired by the city organizers to define what they wanted for their corporate limits. I will also add that 2 of those were areas that were kind of in between other cities, so their descriptions really couldn't go very far. They could only be where it fit because they were bumping up against other municipalities. So to describe those, there wasn't a whole lot of wiggle room there. What they typically do when they hire a third-party group is this is a meets and bounds description that they produce. A meets and bounds description is a written description usually done now by a surveyor or some type of a surveyor group. Used to be in the past done by an attorney. In the past, a meets and bounds description would be similar to follow this road northerly until it intersects with this road, then travel easterly for 5 miles, and then it intersects with this road. It used to be very based on roads and landmarks and whatnot. Now, using the surveyor language, you'll see, and sometimes there are still bills with dealing with other issues where this comes up. The language is to a point, and then you go a certain number of degrees to another point, and we read that and we say, what point is that? We don't know where that is. So what it causes is difficulty for us to verify what is actually on the map. Where is this map, and can we draw that? And we don't have a way to do that. Several other proposed city bills, as you can see on your chart, were able to define their corporate limits using our office. We did a compilation of blocks to define the boundaries of what they wanted for their city. And then they also wanted to have a meets and bounds description in their charter. So they took our map, and then they went to whatever group they hired to do their description and had a meets and bounds drawn from our map. So what we then resulted in is we had a map that we could distribute and define and verify was accurate, and they had a description that they had, in the wording that they wanted to have for the charter. Which is fine. That's perfectly acceptable, and we don't have any problem with that because we're still able to verify the accuracy of the map and know that we have a copy of it in our system that we can stand behind. And then it gives individuals reading the bill a little bit of reference point as they're just looking through it. But it does require the use of that third-party group again, and in the past that has been the responsibility of the organizers to provide that. During the most recent legislative session, the decision was made by the Chairman of Governmental Affairs to approve legislation for incorporations through that committee only using census block descriptions, which is the type of description we produce in our office. This allows for us to verify that the boundaries for these proposed municipalities don't overlap at all, that they are not taking in the same territory into either version in different cities. And it gives us the ability to approve it and make sure that what the committee was passing was sound, which I think is very important. As has been mentioned, I think before, once the bill has been adopted, once the city has been approved by referendum anytime in the future, then annexations can then be taken, by parcel as they choose to. Parcels typically being property lines, more or less. But they can do that at that point. But at the onset of the establishment of the city, we have done, especially this year, we focused on using census block boundaries, which are set in place and are a good firm boundary. I think that is the importance of, why use census blocks. And I think the importance of census blocks is their stability. Block files are available from the Census Bureau, and as Madam Chair mentioned, that the Census Bureau provides these descriptions once a decade. They work in conjunction actually with our office. We work with them through the Block Boundary Suggestion Program at the end of each decade prior to a census to produce and adjust block boundary lines as need be. Their requirements from us, though, when we do that is if we want to add a block line, remove a block line, or whatnot, is that we have to provide them some type of a photograph, an aerial photography, or another map from the county, or something that shows the feature that we're doing it on. They do not want it to be on an invisible feature or just a property line. They want it to be on a physical, geographical feature. So although we're able to make suggestions to them for new census blocks, we do have some parameters that we have to work within to do that. Once they create that block file, it's available for anyone on their website, census.gov. You can go and get that and download a census block file, but you would need GIS software of some sort, not necessarily Maptitude, but some type of a program to use that mapping file. But inside the census block file is of course census data, which is what makes it GIS, because you have data, you have population, you have demographics and other things that are attached to each census block that you have in the file, and that's what makes it so incredibly useful. Another thing about the blocks that's important to note is that they are unchangeable within a decade. So when the block file is created and presented at the beginning of the decade with the new census data, the census does not go in and change that anytime during the decade. Those blocks stand and they remain in place throughout that 10-year cycle. That's a good thing, I think, because there's consistency in that, and knowing what those blocks are. We want to reference something from 3 years ago using these blocks. We are able to do that. They also make available previous iterations of the block file. So if we needed to go back and recreate something from 2003, we would be able to access a 2000 block file as it was, and we could use that listing of blocks to correspond with that file and match it up. They don't replace blocks with new blocks, don't replace old blocks, so you can maintain that from one cycle to the next. which is not always the case, I know, at the local level and some of the work they do with parcels and with city limit boundaries. We've run into issues before where they replace the old with the new, and then there's no record of what to do at that point. Let's see. Block boundaries being primarily on visible features, that typically would include roads, highways, rivers, creeks, streams, lakes, railroads, power lines, pipelines, things that you can pretty much see. That makes it a lot easier when you create a map based off that for anybody to look at it and say, oh, it follows this road, it follows this creek, it follows whatnot. You can visually see that and know where that goes. I will say that occasionally you'll find a block that is on something that's an unknown feature or it's an extension of a feature, but it's pretty rare. And they try, of course, like I said, now they don't want to approve any adjustments to those lines that don't have something attached to it to show what it is. Using geographical features, though, does not require the assistance of any kind of advanced survey or training or special equipment. So that makes it a lot easier for the average person to know what they're looking at. And like I said before, the population data from that census is attached within the block file. That's kind of how they subdivide the data down into the smallest level. The blocks are the smallest groupings of geography that they can do that with. And so it does help know how many people you're including into a city when you use that file, the demographic breakdown of that city, even down to when you start to create districts, the same thing, you're able to group those together and know the demographics, know the number of population that you're talking about. When we draw redistricting maps, of course, we're obligated to use those block files to create those districts. And we're also obligated to use the census data from that decade. So within that 10-year cycle, you're using the same data throughout the whole thing. Even if you wanted to redraw and say in 2019 we want to redraw, we're going to still be using 2010 data to do that because you don't use estimate data, you only use the official census count. So there again is that stability for the decade that holds in place throughout. Parcels, I know, have been mentioned as ways to to draw city boundaries or city districts. And the thing about parcels, a parcel file does not have that population data attached to it. It often follows property lines, which are not visible features, not recognizable. I wouldn't know where my property lines were if I didn't have a fence around it, and you probably can understand the same thing. They are changed at the whim of each county. They can be changed multiple times in a month. I mean, they can happen whenever, real estate, they want to divide up a parcel of land to sell. They subdivide that into multiple parcels. That changes. Those changes go into the county file for their updates, and that happens as often as they choose. There's no rhyme or reason to it. It just deals with their real estate, and each county is different in how they do that. In order to obtain that data, we could obtain parcel data. We would have to go to each individual county to do that, and to get a parcel file from each county would require that they have GIS of some sort and have an electronic parcel file they could provide to us. And if we did use that, we could work with that and we could put together something, but we would have no data attached to it. It would just be a visual interpretation of what you're looking at. It wouldn't have population and demographics and all that associated with it. It would also, not correspond with that geography. So when we go to define the districts for that municipality, you could have, if you did your corporate description using parcel boundaries, then you tried to do your district. You couldn't do your district description using parcel boundaries, so you would have them on different geography then in order to compile the data that you would need to balance those districts and create them equally. I think we've heard from over the previous meetings about the process that these municipalities go through to incorporate. I know that it's been mentioned it was initially set by Congressman Austin Scott when he was chair of Governmental Affairs, and it was set to be over the 2-year biennium. The bill was to be dropped in the first year, the feasibility study would be done, and in the second year it would move through the process legislatively. At the time, there have been different reasons why they said, this has been said, this is why this was done. I know for me, I understood that this was to be certain that cities were thoroughly vetted and proper study was done, education of the public could take place. As far as our office is concerned, during that cycle, if we're able to set initial footprint, which we need to set in place before they have their study done, we are using that time period to provide the data to the Carl Vinson Institute or to the Andrew Young School so that they have the map, they have the data, they have what we have in our system to provide to them for purposes of their study that they're doing. So we're in contact with them as well during the process to give them the information. Also during that time period, all they really need to work on the study is the footprint, the outline of the corporate limits. But then at that point in time, we have the time to prepare a district description, which can, as some of you know, take a while to work through to get agreement on what we want this district description to be. So we use that time in between as well to draw a district map that will then be added into the body of the bill for their council districts. From what I've been able to tell, the process has been maintained for most of these cities. It's gone through that standard process more or less, and has seemed to work fairly well. I think the consistency is important. I think that's kind of part of what we're here for, is to establish consistency in the process so everybody gets a fair shake at how they go through this. But we are involved in it fairly deeply throughout the process. I know you may not have been aware of how much we were involved in what we do to help this roll along. So, but we are there, and we are glad to provide that the technical assistance that is needed. One additional consideration that I'd like to note too, that I'm not aware of there being any time limit for legislation to be refiled. Once a city has had their bill pass through the process, they present a referendum to the public votes the referendum down. We've only had this happen once, but there's no limit or no time frame set for when can they present another bill and say, do it again, go through it again and say, well, we're going to try again. The city organizers want to put that bill back before the people again and do that referendum over. The only one, as you see on your list there, that has done that was the city of South Fulton. It was presented. It was the referendum was given to the people. They voted it down fairly heavily, I believe, at that time. And then it took about 9 years. They decided to try to work on that again. And they're currently in the process of looking at their options as far as forming the city of South Fulton or what other choices they may have in that region for annexation and whatnot. But just to consider, maybe should there be any kind of a frame there or a window of time through which, though we don't have every other year, well, this referendum failed, let's do it again. This one failed, let's do it again. Just to consider for future city creations. I know, Madam Chair, you mentioned their certification process, and that's one other thing I would like to mention. We presently certify local redistricting bills that come through intergovernmental coordination in the House. They have I guess it's a rule set up in place so that any bill that comes to them for local redistricting is then sent to our office for a certification form prior to that bill being, I guess, moved out of committee. That is only set in place, I think, with that committee and only for local redistricting bills. But I would like to propose that for these city creation bills, especially ones we have drafted, that be put in place as well for us to be able to take a final look over the bill, make sure there are no corrections or errors in it, because once we create our description, it goes to Legislative Council. Things can happen. We just want to put one more pair of eyes on it before it goes through the process. So both committees, and maybe a rule or something that need to be considered, that we just get one more chance to take a final glance over it and sign off on what's in that bill before it goes further into the process. But that's just one other thing I'd like to request. Our office, we keep a full-time staff. We are there all the time through all years. So there's not just around the decennial census as some people think, but we're glad to help. We're glad to assist and provide whatever data, maps, and assistance any of you may need. You're welcome to contact us at any time, and I'll be glad to take questions if there are any from the committee.
Okay, I'll recognize Representative Oliver.
Thank you, your staff, for all the help that you've given us in this difficult time about trying to draw maps all in the 87 House district. I noticed that 6 of your 10 cities created did not use the block computer map. 6 of the 10 used meets and bounds, which imposes a cost on the organizer. Are there other programs available to you that other cities or states use that would give more flexibility in census calculation?
First of all, the ones that say meets and bounds from a block map actually did use the block map first. So they used our software and drew the map and then went and paid additional money because they chose to have an additional description drawn. So I think there were only 3 that solely went outside of what our capabilities were to have their description drawn. They can... I'm not. We don't do meets and bounds. The meets and bounds description is not a software program. I don't know of. That's something a surveyor goes out on the street and does. So no, ma'am, we don't have the capability to do that exactly.
Any other software programs that are capable of being purchased that use data other than census tracts that would offer more flexibility?
The other counties and local jurisdictions use different type of GIS software that they can use for their mapping purposes. A lot of them use a type of ArcView, which is another GIS program. My experience with ArcView is very limited. I brought my GIS manager. He could speak more to that as far as what the capability of that program is compared to what we have. I don't know that it takes census data into account. I don't know that it's more than just a mapping tool. Rob, would you have anything to add? Yeah, sure. This is Rob Strangia. He's a member of my staff, and he's our GIS manager, and he's certified in GIS as well.
Good morning. The other softwares, they still use the same base data. They have different ways of doing it, but it's still using the same data.
Does it allow through a computer program to draw a line other than a census block line?
You can draw the line, but you're not going to have the data involved. You're not going to have the census data that shows the population and demographics. You can draw the line on anything with the computer, wherever you tell it to put it, but you're not going to have the data that underlines it.
In relation to the elimination of Section 5 of the Crime Rights Act, are you all going to seminars where people are telling you that it's going to be a different kind of mapping process in the future, that the technology is going to have to change, could change in relation to a totally different process in your district?
No, ma'am, I'm not aware of anything as far as changing. There are always other states are considering different methods by which they would go about the process in terms of whether it's an independent group that does it through versus their local legislature or whatever. But as far as the software goes, no, I'm not aware of anybody making changes there.
Y'all's capability is really amazing. I mean, those of us that have always sat with that is very, very impressive. But if you are a group of citizens who are required to develop meets and bounds in the free-flowing, line-changing mechanism of our politics down here, clearly you're not going to be able to participate. Do you agree?
Well, there are, in the last few years, there have been new programs that are even available online, tools that anyone can just go to. We actually have had people submit proposed maps to us using these programs where they can go on into the software, and it's an online available thing to draw what they want to draw. I know one of them is called Dave's Redistricting. There are various programs now, and these are new. They've just come out within the last handful of years or so. There are programs, right. That particular software program is I'm trying to think of how it was manipulated. You do it online, but you can create a file that you take out of that, and we can import it into our system.
It's still using the same data that we use.
Right.
It's just it's just an online, simplified online version of our software that's available to the public, where they can go and draw the boundaries, and it's going to give them the population information involved, just like we would.
But it's based off the same thing. Sure.
We've discussed this, and I'm very concerned. There is a clear perception of groups of citizens in my district that they could not participate based on your program. We can argue whether that's a good perception, bad perception, accurate or inaccurate. But it does seem to me that if they're going to have to draw new meets and bounds descriptions to get an accurate line in the context of the political war, that's going to really eliminate an opportunity.
Well, we are definitely glad to have citizens come in and work with us at the sponsorship of members, of course, because we are an office of the General Assembly, and we've worked with lots of groups that have come in who wanted to do that, and we're glad to do that and let them see what it is and how our system works. Of course, we do require that a member sponsor a group that wants to come in and do that. It is difficult, I think, for the public to be able to understand exactly how the process works and what we're looking at, even using those online tools. Sometimes it's easy to click around and form whatever it is that you think looks good, but there are other things that go into play when you're considering what you're putting into a new municipality, obviously, as we've seen. So there are a lot of considerations to take into account. I mean, I'm definitely in favor of letting the public, have access as much as possible. Like I said, we just authorize you all to let us know, what group you want to have come in and work with us. But I understand it is challenging. I know we have discussed the area, I know in your district and all, quite a bit. So I'm aware of the difficulty there.
I would call on Chairman Reinders.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to go through the process and let people know for the point of clarification. Thank you so much, Gina. She put on my radar screen last year about some maps that wanted to use parcels. And if, in fact, you use the parcels, is it not true that you couldn't get an accurate count of potentially the feasibility study because you wouldn't know how many people, you wouldn't know the commercial? I mean, it's almost a contradiction to say you just can't count it if you use a parcel. That was a request y'all made, correct?
That's correct.
So we we have to use census blocks now. Is that a federal guideline to use census blocks?
For redistricting, I think we are required to use blocks. I don't know how federal redistrict. I don't know if it's a federal law, but and we have always been required to use blocks.
Yeah, well, and that's kind of where I was going. If we're required, and you talked about, let's see, what was the phrase? Education of the public. And the only thing that I heard that I thought was kind of interesting is that we want to use census blocks and when we're drawing districts. We want to use census blocks when we're making new cities, but we don't use census blocks when we do annexation?
Annexations have been done on parcel lines for as long as I'm aware of, and that may be something to check into with council. But
why wouldn't that make it easier for you on that? If the meets and the bounds and the other is just drawing a line anywhere, why wouldn't it make it easier for you to use the same census blocks that we're using for cities or for precincts? It just seems to me if that's the easiest way to go and that's the way your software sets up, it sure seems like it'd be easy to use the same kind of blocks when you're annexing.
Well, I think the difficulty with annexation, and I'm sure the cities would be able to explain this a little better, is that oftentimes when someone is annexing into a city or wants to be annexed, it may just be one parcel or two parcels or part of a neighborhood or whatnot, and they want to be able to take in a smaller grouping of people or property owners or whatnot into the city. When you're initially creating the city, I don't know that same standard is as important because we're trying to create the initial footprint, the initial boundary of what is the city. So when they want to expand, I think the laws have changed a little bit over some time as far as what they use to do that. I know they used to be able to take in an island that they just wanted to take in that didn't touch. Now they have.
I guess the question is specifically, wouldn't it be easier for you to use census blocks than parcels?
It would be if we are the only ones involved in annexation. Typically, annexation.
I mean, if it's easier for cityhood, to me the logic expands that it would be easier on annexation as well because you know where they're at.
It would be, sir, if we were involved in that annexation, the process of that, we're not typically involved in. Most cities do their annexation, as far as I understand, outside of the General Assembly. They can do that through you all, but they don't have to. And at that point, they use whatever they're using, and I think the law allows for that.
And as it relates to the education of the public, split census blocks. Do you find that confusing to people when it comes to where there's... For the people in the back, you can't see your smile to that question.
Well, split census blocks is not something that
they're even familiar with.
Right. I mean, we don't... So
if there's confusion in one district, most people don't even know that census blocks. They understand where the road is, where the creek is. Right?
That's correct. They know the geography more than they know anything about
anything about a census block.
That's correct.
All right, very good. And finally, you ask the certification.
Yes, sir.
And have a second set of eyes.
Yes, sir.
And if you want time to think about this, we don't have to know this now. This really relates to Governmental Affairs Committee. If I were to try to look at that, all right, what I don't want, as you can imagine, is a time frame that moves on how long you need to have that second set of eyes. So you need to let me know at some point, because that second set of eyes to me could change if you have a city of 30,000 or a city of 300,000.
Well,
and if we're going to pass legislation because the Senate gave us something back on day 37, we've seen that movie, haven't we?
Yes, sir.
And you tell me, Ed, I got to have 4 days. Not that she calls me Ed. Thank you, Gina. But if you need 4 days, I would hate for the other body to be able to do that knowing that we've got something in a rule that would then really be for the purpose of killing something. You don't think people game it out that way, do you?
No, sir. And I can tell you typically with a certification, I'll explain just a little bit of what I do, and I'm usually the one who signs off on those in our office. It's more or less just verifying that the plan name that's in the body of the bill corresponds to the plan name that was supposed to be in the body of the bill, and that nothing was, like a line may not be eliminated in terms of the text. Sometimes that's cut off for different reasons when they're preparing it. We're double checking that if there's a district description, the correct number of districts are there as what corresponds to what's in the wording of the bill. Those types of technical things.
Scrivener's errors, is that the word?
Yes, sometimes that's what it is. Sometimes it can just be just a wording. It can be just some of the data that might have gotten left out of the description. You can double check with intergovernmental coordination on how long it takes us to turn those around. I think Leo could probably speak to that, but normally it's not 4 days. I usually try to get those turned around within a reasonable amount of time. And if there is a time frame that needs to be kept in mind, if there's something they want to get on the calendar by a certain date, with the local redistricting, Leo has always said, we're trying to get this on the calendar by Tuesday. Can you make sure you try to get us that certification before then? And I have not had any problems with that. I don't know if you all can speak to whether that's worked for you.
Thank you, Gina. Thank you, Madam Chair.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Chairman Reinders. And we have had a couple of, you were saying that most annexations are taking place on the local level and don't come through the General Assembly, but yet we do have a few. And so my question would be, you were speaking about setting the footprint for the creation of new cities, and that's a 2-year process, as we all know. What if we get an annexation bill that comes in and they're talking about grabbing some of that, some few census tracts or boundaries of some that are within the set footprint? Does that not upset the fiscal study and change the dynamics that have already been put into place?
Yes, I believe it does, and I don't know that there's anything that's been spelled out to prevent that from happening as of yet. I know when we looked at the area down in South Fulton County some years ago, as they were attempting to create that city of South Fulton, the existing municipalities were annexing quite a bit during that time period, which made it very difficult for anyone to know which portions were now in a city and which ones were not, and also resulted in a lot of bizarre shaped lines in that area that are still in existence. So it does pose quite a difficulty.
So even though it's a 2-year process set in place, you've established the footprint, they've spent money on a fiscal study, we don't have anything in place right now that protects those boundaries from encroachment, for lack of a better word, by someone trying to pass an annexation bill?
I'm not aware of any. No.
Okay. Thank you. I would call on Representative Taylor for a question.
Actually, just going back to that, and it really can change the dynamic, because if you do the 100% annexation method, even after a bill is passed, if you're talking about a high-value commercial area or something like that, it can throw the whole mix way off. And I don't know that we have anything to address that, but yes, it has happened, and it can really make a huge difference depending on what if it's one gas station, it might not mean that much, but if it's a huge commercial area like a mall or something like that, it can really throw the entire viability or your study just out the wind. Just
That's
a comment.
Right. Yeah. The moving boundary issue is definitely one that needs to be considered, because in the 2-year cycle, like I said, initially it was to be that the footprint was established when the bill was dropped in the first year of the biennium. And then you had, that was more or less, I don't know that there was anything written down that said it has to be, it's frozen at that point, or it can be protected by anything at that point. But that was so that you would be able to get an accurate viability study and know what that is. But once those boundaries start to shift and change, and we've had a lot of that with the recent work we've done, and they've changed a lot, and there have been annexations that came into some of that area. So then you're up in a position of your study, how accurate is your study now? Do you need to pay and have that study done again? And these groups, they fund those studies themselves. So it's definitely something to look into as to whether or not, how do you freeze the proposed boundaries of a city against a city that's in existence who wants to annex that. I don't know that I mean, that's something the committee would need to consider. I'm not sure of the answer to that.
And I just go back and say, you know, having worked with you with redistricting as well as the city stuff, what these folks do, if you haven't seen it, is pretty amazing. I mean, you can shift a line and, okay, we just added 18 people to this. I mean, it's really down to, it's not crayons and magic markers or anything like that. It's actually,
Thank goodness.
I mean, you can almost, for lack of a better word, see the people moving in there because, I mean, you can take in one little thing and say, okay, that added 180 people or just, subtracted 60. But the technology that you guys use now is absolutely amazing with that. And the cooperation of that office has also been both with the redistricting, which I think we spent an entire summer together in 2011 with that. It's a great staff and a great group of folks to work with.
Thank you, Representative.
Thank you. Do we have any further questions by the committee members? Any further statements from you?
I think we've
Either of
covered
you?
a lot of it, and we're glad to help in any way that we can.
Thank you so much for being with us today. We appreciate the information you've given us. Next, I would like to call on Tom Gell from the Georgia Municipal Association for his closing comments or a summary statement.
Good morning, Madam Chair, members of the committee. My name is Tom Gale. I'm with the Georgia Municipal Association, and I just want to thank you all for taking the time to listen to some of the ideas that we've brought through this process, to use this as a resource. We have really one suggestion for this committee, and it's basically a suggestion that is aimed at increasing transparency and preventing the kind of shock that came to the city of Waycross as a result of local legislation. You heard from the folks from Waycross at the first meeting who expressed some concerns, and our basic proposal, we're going to try to draft some language to submit to the committee for a potential bill, but our proposal is basically if you all are going to be members of the General Assembly going to be filing local legislation, rather than just publishing in the legal organ a notice and then having that legal organ attached to the bill with an affidavit signed by the member of the General Assembly, have it so that there's a specific requirement that all affected local governments, be it the county or the city or multiple cities, when local legislation is introduced to affect those local governments, that they get a certified letter in addition to the publication of a legal notice. The intent there is not to stop or prevent any kind of powers that you all have as members of the General Assembly, but to basically make sure that if there's any change in a charter, particularly if it relates to the boundaries of a corporate to the corporate boundaries of a municipality, that both the county and the city get notice of that particular proposal, and then they can make the case with you all that it's good, bad, or that they're ambivalent. So that's really our only suggestion for the committee. And again, we appreciate you all really going through the hard work of this process to look into annexation, de-annexation, and incorporation. And I'll be glad to try to answer any questions if there are any.
Thank you, Mr. Gale. Thank you. I'd call on Representative Oliver for a question.
I think that's a good suggestion. It just seems like a practical suggestion. But following up with your suggestion in the prior discussion, my constituents were promised by leaders that they would be allowed to be de-annexed since the line, in their view, was messed up and divided their neighborhoods for the possible city of La Vista based on alleged census tract reasons. So if they're promised, oh, you'll have a right to de-annex if the city passes and you're in the wrong side, is it your understanding that they can only do that by census tract, or can they do that by meets and bounds? Do you have an understanding of that?
Well,
And the difference between your rural community down there in Waycross versus our densely created neighborhoods in the city of Atlanta?
Well, I guess I'm just not aware of the promise or who made it or
Yeah,
what that
right.
entails. I don't really know particularly what that means or what you're referring to. But I think the way that the de-annexation works is you all have plenary power to basically carve out territory from municipalities. That's your power as members of the General Assembly. So if you all are if the promise prevails through the 91 votes in the House and 29 in the Senate, well, then the promise is fulfilled through the plenary power of the General Assembly.
It's just an issue of transparency, and again, citizens. I understand that through the development of the federal case law on Section 5 Voting Rights Act, that census tract data has been accepted. That's been part of the case law. I'm not as familiar that I see a changing world in relation to Voting Rights Act, and a changing world in relation to data. And that part of that changing world is evidenced what's happening here in Georgia about these municipality issues. So all of that is very current in my mind. And the only option of census tract, setting aside the past freedoms of cities to go to meets and bounds, seems to me that we're creating more possible roadblocks here, and less transparency for citizens who believe that they should have the right to choose how they wish to be governed.
Chairman Reinders.
Thank you. Thank you, Tom, for your testimony today. We've talked about promises, not just from cities, but school boards, county. We've heard testimony in a couple meetings about misleading information. And you're exactly right. If one city commissioner is no longer in office, promised something to one person, according to that one person, nobody else was in the room, how do you verify that? And is that a legal standard to say you must then change everything that's going on as it relates to annexation, de-annexation, getting a service? And that's why, Madam Chair, I bring that up, because everybody says, well, they told me. And that's not a standard. That's why I really think the first part of testimony, when we get ready to talk about this, the first testimony that we had earlier from Jeff about making those legal descriptions, that's why I think that's so critical. So at the end of the day, if somebody was given bad information, at least they can hang their hat on, in that interest of transparency, that ad that ran, that wasn't written so generically that there can be no misunderstanding. At the end of the day, I think that at a bare minimum, that's what we can do to give greater clarification, instead of all this, well, I was promised I could get out, and I was promised I could get in, and I was promised I was going to get 24-hour-a-day police protection, because we don't know who's been promised what. And that's not a standard we can govern by. Do you agree with that?
Well, I think that, and I think Jeff made a good point, the legal notices can be so vague that you have no clue as a member of the public, or a member of the city council or county commission, what the specific intent of the bill is, unless you figure out what the bill number is, go online and take a look at it. So, and that's assuming you've read the legal notice to begin with to know that the bill has been introduced. So making sure that the legal notice is written in a way that a layman would understand the effect of it on the city or the county would probably be important. I mean,
I've read things that have been sent to me via emails by people who think they're anointed anti-city or pro-city or this or that, and half of that information is wrong.
Yeah,
by the experts, or the anointed self-experts.
And I don't know what kind of burden it puts on Lake Council to draft these kind of legal notices. You'll have to ask them, but I think that the intent of it is just transparency, and our feeling is that if we get notification and a copy of the proposed local bill from members of the General Assembly to the City Council, to the governing body, to the county or city, it at least gives them the ability to consult with their city or county attorney, look over what the bill does. So in lieu of a plain English legal notice advertisement, actually getting a copy of the bill and letting them have time to consult and then give feedback if needed to the General Assembly probably be a better process and be more transparent. And they may be able to provide the translation if it's not there through some sort of... That's
a better fix than the city mayor promised me this, that there's no proof of.
Well, and the mayor, just like the heads of committees or
Right.
leadership here, can't promise something for the body. Only the body can deliver on the
Right.
promise. So same with the city council. You need a majority, and same with the county commission. One person can't promise for a governing body.
Right.
That's something
Thank you,
wrong.
Madam Chair. Thank you, Tom.
Representative Taylor.
And just going to that, just through experience, what a group that is looking to incorporate citizens for a better Waycross or whatever that may be, they can make all the promises in the world they want, but they're not elected officials. At that time, you elect the city council. They have they have a enumerated powers that they can do 180 out from what was proposed once they're elected, and that's just, I mean, the facts of life.
Yeah, and the needs of community can change through time as communities grow. It could be that the intention of a particular area is to have greater fire service, but it may be that they just want to have better control over planning and zoning. But 5 years later, they may want to have fire service, but it's up to those elected officials in working with their constituents to figure out what's the best service level, et cetera. So yes, I would agree.
You can, and I'm, having been through that process, so we started the Dunwoody effort. We had a population of 37,000. Now we have a population of 50,000 at night and a population of 135,000 during the day. And that, so if you looked at the original bills way back, when that changed just based on reality.
Right.
Do we have any further questions from the committee members?
Madam Chair, if I could just,
Yes.
This is something that was brought up when Gina was talking. I just want to mention the question, I think, came about the two-year process for cityhood and how the proposed cities, as introduced in legislation, can be impacted. Those borders can be impacted through annexation. Yes, that happens. It has happened in the past. I think the South Fulton example was one that was mentioned. It really is kind of for you all to talk about the balance when you've got a pending bill on incorporation, the balance between the citizens who are typically asking to annex versus a pending bill that may or may not pass the General Assembly. I think something for you all that I would point out to you all that also happened in District 42 in Representative Oliver's backyard. A similar thing happened with the city of Brookhaven and Chamblee when there was 100% annexation. A business owner, property owner, felt like they would be better served by annexing through the 100% method into the city of Brookhaven. Brookhaven accepted their petition, and the city of Chamblee sued because Representative Oliver had passed a bill, not just introduced a bill, but had passed a bill through the General Assembly that set up a particular area to be annexed that included that property owner's area. It went all the way to the Georgia Supreme Court. The Georgia Supreme Court held that not just because a bill has been introduced, but a bill had been passed that set up a pending referendum, that it essentially froze that area from having a general law 100% method process to annex until the failure or passage of that referendum. The passage resulted in it being ineligible for, and chime in if you can explain it better than me, but basically that may be something for you all for instructive purposes in deciding what you all want to do. I would suggest that until you pass a bill, there should be no impingement upon private property rights of people who feel more comfortable going with the city next door that has a track record versus a potential city that may or may not pass through the General Assembly. So that would be my suggestion, that court case dealing with annexation may be instructive for how you deal with the same situation in incorporation, proposed incorporation.
Representative Oliver.
Sometimes when the General Assembly tries to improve upon a Supreme Court case to set the law, we don't always do it as Mr. Lanier agrees as perfectly as we would. But I think the Chamblee versus Brookhaven was again an example where the citizens were being totally ignored. citizens were getting ready to vote for annexation into Chamblee, and the business owner says, we don't care. I think that the case was helpful and decided in a clear way, in my view, that if the General Assembly had passed a bill allowing citizens to vote, that the 100% method would not be allowed to the business owner to jump ahead of that annexation. So we can look at codifying that, but we might mess it up.
Well, I'm not necessarily I would suggest that is the rule of the land here in Georgia, but it's and I would speculate, but I would rely on your legal counsel to give you his opinion. But I would speculate that the same sort of situation could happen when you've got a proposed annexation. Proposed incorporation. Let's say the city of Decatur tomorrow accepts 100% petition from half of La Vista Hills. How does that impact the vote in November? So I think and that's arguably unclear because the court case dealt with just a pending annexation,
right,
not a pending incorporation. So that's something for you all to consider. But I would argue that until a referendum is scheduled, don't impinge upon those private property owners' rights to decide what city is in their best interest until you all decide a bill's worthy of passing and a referendum set.
Chairman Reinders.
I want to dig in the weeds on that a little bit, and Jeff, chime in if I may. And you're right about sometimes people mess up Supreme Court rulings. I see it in Washington almost every day, especially with this Supreme Court. But anyway, I just want to make sure, because, Tom, this is what I've been told, but here we go with the told and the promises and that what they said. But if you ask me, do I think it's happened, my answer would be yes. That we've got a system in place that's not broken. If you don't want it, I get it, but nothing's ever going to be 100%. You're going to incorporate this new area. Some of this things is 92% pass rate. And because someone doesn't like it, you know what they do? They quickly go in and say, I got an idea. Why don't we just quickly annex this part of Sandy Springs hypothetically? Really for the purpose of potentially stopping the incorporation, because for 20 years before that, they had no interest in annexing that piece of property. They're gaming the system to stop something bigger. Is it your opinion that the court case that we're referencing stops that?
Well,
I'm talking about people that annex for gaming the system to stop something else.
I guess I don't know the motives of why private property owners would want, or communities or neighborhoods would want to annex into an existing city, except I would suggest it's probably less to stop. It's in their. I'm assuming that that they're feeling that it's in their best interest that rather than wait to see.
I'm not necessarily talking about the private property owner that goes and makes a request. I'm talking about a local governing entity that then turns around and says, you know what, maybe's now the time to annex, which could throw off the feasibility study.
Well,
I'm asking, does that court case cover that kind of scenario?
Well, keep in mind,
Jeff?
No, as it stands now, no.
Okay.
Keep in mind that the annexation, cities don't annex like Pac-Man or anything. They basically they have to have it.
Well, some don't.
Well, I mean, you're aware of the processes of annexation. You need to have the owners involved and wanting to be in the city. And most of the annexations that occur in this state are 100% method annexations, which means everybody who wants to come into the city comes into the city if the city approves. But then you've got other supermajority threshold processes like the 60% method. So cities may be interested in wooing areas and showing them why they are better suited to be in a particular existing city versus rolling their dice with a new city. But
so if the elected
cities don't
official,
control that.
if the elected official without an act of the governing body, as we referenced earlier, goes in and promises someone in South Fulton, you'd much rather be with me than with them. And what we ultimately end up doing is picking cherry picking 8, 10, 12, 14 pieces of 100%. This is one private owner saying, I want to go in, who happens to be commercial, for the purposes potentially of devaluing the likelihood of that South Fulton, in this case, hypothetically, passing. We think that that's okay. You never wanted to annex for 25 years before. You never made them that offer. I think it does go to the motives of what that particular city is trying to do, is stop this.
Well, and I'm not going to
Right, you wouldn't know the motivation in their heart. I get
I'm
it.
not going to guess what motivations are out there. I mean, again, it's a governing body that honors promises, not one city official or one county official. And so, my feeling is that if it's only rational for property owners to try to figure out which government is best for them as property owners, and they're the ones who ultimately make the decision. So if anybody needs to be worried about promises, it's the people who are petitioning for annexation. And you have to assume that they're at least the best educated in making that decision, rather than trying to second guess their motives for why they decided to annex into a particular city or choose not to annex into a particular city.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you.
If we have no further questions or comments, we will excuse you and we'll ask Todd Edwards.
Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate your presentation. Todd Edwards with the Association of County Commissioners of Georgia. And just to let the committee know, we're running pretty much on time. We do have a presentation after this one and public comments. So we hope to close at 12 because I do have another study committee at 1. I know. Exactly.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee. I'm Todd Edwards with the Association County Commissioners of Georgia. And with me today is Ken Gerard. He's the attorney with Gerard and Davis and also serves as the Forsyth County attorney. I'll apologize up front. I'm getting over a cold, so I hope you can hear me okay. I have water in case the throat acts up. ACCG wishes to thank all of y'all for taking the time and the efforts over this interim to study the issues involved with annexation, de-annexation, and incorporation. It's been our privilege at ACCG to participate in these meetings. We've tried very hard to meet y'all's information request, provide you some documentation and information from our members, Georgia counties, and Georgia citizens on the possible impacts. Again, ACCG is not against new cities. We represent all the citizens of Georgia, whether they be in unincorporated areas, new cities, or in proposed boundaries of proposed boundaries of new cities or existing municipalities. We do, however, feel that there are some flaws in the current process of incorporation, and we've been charged with coming forward, and believe we will today, with recommendations to address those. Currently, members of the General Assembly are caught between a rock and a hard place. This happens during the incorporation process, where you get pulled from one direction to another on boundaries, on shifting boundaries. A lot of times you got existing cities, as was mentioned, wishing to annex once this process has already begun. You've got counties coming to you listing the impact or possible impacts on their revenues, their fees, and their budgets. You've got unincorporated neighborhoods pulled between either annexation or joining the new city. And you've got existing cities, and often, as we've heard with South Fulton, it becomes quite challenging when you have independent school districts involved. There's no easy answer. However, we believe with a few measures put into statute, we can have a more deliberative, predictable, and consistent process for establishing cities in Georgia. Annexation, incorporation, we've been through the first couple of committees, impacts not only the areas that are to be annexed or incorporated, but it impacts the county's revenues to carry out the mandated services under state law that we're in charge of carrying out. It also impacts effective and efficient service delivery. I've shown you maps of some uniquely drawn city boundaries and trying to serve, particularly with public safety, those areas, and those areas can be challenging. It impacts the community's long-term land use and zoning plans. It impacts, as we've heard from our friends in Waycross when they've come and testified about de-annexing. Same with annexation. It impacts our ability to invest in infrastructure, to know those future infrastructure needs and to plan accordingly. Again, that happens with both annexation and de-annexation. Impacts unincorporated neighborhoods, possibly property values, neighboring cities and their future growth plans. And de-annexation, what we've learned, and all the discussion on private property rights for annexation is not a private property right. In fact, the only way to de-annex whatever promises were made was with consent of the city, and the city having unilateral veto authority over that proposed de-annexation. We also will end up today on arguing that whatever notices has been argued for de-annexation should be put in law should also apply to the legislative means of annexation. If there's a de-annexation going on and certified mail delivered to the city council where that de-annexation is to take place, fair is fair. We would only ask that the county officials be notified in a community whenever an annexation is being proposed through legislative annexation. Suggested improvements. I've handed you all a handout. There's about 2 pages. I'll get short and to the point since you have this all in front of you. ACCG believes that more of these rules should be set in statute. Now, I understand that the General Assembly likes its flexibility, and that can come in handy. However, often legislators are getting pulled in multiple directions, particularly as boundaries are being proposed to be changed, rechanged, and we mentioned earlier about the redrawn maps and some of the complications. This will relieve some of the pressure on y'all and add more consistency to the process. ACCG also believes prior to the legislation being started that a petition be required at the local level. That will help you decide whether or not there's adequate support at the local. Once you set the boundaries in the proposed new incorporation, get a petition. That'll give you some indication of how popular this is within the impacted community. Looking for precedent, we've currently got one in state law from when a county wants to go from dry to selling packaged liquor that requires 35% of the registered voters voting in the prior election sign that petition. And I would urge that creating a new city is no less important than selling packaged liquor within a community, and the 35% petition might be appropriate for your consideration in this process. Again, this is going to provide you a better indication of whether or not the community and it will be impacted clearly once this. We also believe that the current feasibility study should be expanded, not just to study the feasibility of the new city, but the impacts on all areas. Let's look at how it impacts the county's budgets and the revenues, the near and long-term financial impact on both the county, the unincorporated areas, and the existing cities. Look at the lost revenue that's going to impact the county. What new fees and revenues will the new city get for being formed? And are these fees and revenues commensurate to the services which that city will be providing? Part of the challenge in the current process is the county, other cities, and a lot of citizens aren't quite sure what services that new city will be providing, what will be drawn from an intergovernmental contract either with the county or existing cities. As discussed during the last meeting, and this will be a difficult challenge, part of that new and expanded feasibility or fiscal impact study we believe should have a draft service delivery recommendation on what services the city will be providing, roughly to what extent, and what they'll be looking at the county to continue to provide through intergovernmental agreements. On that subject, we would urge the General Assembly to reject any notion that or legislation that would force a county to provide all infrastructure free of charge, which would fall into the boundaries of a new incorporated city. This came up Sandy Springs and Dunwoody as well. I believe it got worked out, although there was a legislative change for Dunwoody, but this includes fire stations, police stations, and libraries. And I know the arguments on both sides of that, but I believe this could be worked out. We heard earlier that this could all be solved by better communications. This could be solved by communications internally between the city and the county and other impacted parties. Knowing the fiscal feasibility and having the petition, again, is going to provide legislators a lot easier process and more predictability in establishing cities, and it's also going to give you an indication, and ultimately the voters in the new proposed city, an indication of whether or not this is the right decision to make. Legislative action, we do believe that the General Assembly should still have to approve the cities via legislation, but again, this process is going to be made a lot easier by the feasibility study and some of the other provisions that I've just mentioned. The 2-year schedule, we do appreciate this being in law, or as a rule of the committee, and in consideration to putting it in statute so there's no further pressure to change this during the process, ACCG would recommend. And of course, with the bills being introduced in the first year, the study, the petition, then being voted on in the second year. The referendum process, We do believe that statute, and we appreciate that all the new cities that have been created, the 10 over the past so many years, have gone through a referendum process. We do appreciate that and believe that should be set in statute. Not only should involving the referendum process, we do believe that since the impact is far beyond the actual city that could be created, that all voters within the county be allowed to vote in that process. The city light, and we've been over this concept before, we believe it's a recipe for ineffective and inefficient service delivery. We believe it's constitutionally flawed, and that any notion sold to voters on a city-like concept whereby the city is limited to providing only certain services is meant specifically to mislead these voters, because by constitutionally and the other arguments put forth, once formed a city, they can provide any of the enumerated powers that they wish to provide. Lastly, another thing I wanted to bring up, and I mentioned on it earlier, is that when new cities are created, ensure that the fees and revenues that are going to them are commensurate to the services which they assume. We talked at length earlier about the services and how you know whether the city is actually providing the services. That does get difficulty, setting the thresholds and whatnot. If any is consideration defining and providing minimum thresholds in law, also in this process require that each service claimed to be provided is in fact provided and not just on paper. Thirdly, make it clear that in order for a contract with the county, that service to count toward one of the three services, that the service is above and beyond what the county would otherwise provide its unincorporated residents or the residents of a county as a whole. And then lastly, make sure that there's a valid and enforceable contract between the city and county to provide those intergovernmental services that are listed in the minutes of both the governing bodies of both the county and the city. Unincorporated islands, we believe that law should be changed to prohibit the creation of unincorporated islands within the boundaries of a new municipality. Cities abutting cities, you've all run into this where you have proposed boundaries. You've got cities annexing, particularly for commercial properties or revenue generating. Reinstate the 3-mile rule. That would be one of our recommendations. New incorporations within existing city boundaries, whatever rules are set for incorporating unincorporated areas or creating new cities, we'd also ask that a similar provisions apply and abilities created so that those disenfranchised or feeling remote from an existing city can form cities within existing municipalities. De-annexation, as mentioned before, is not a private property right. It's at the whim of the city council whether or not, other than through legislative means, whether or not you can get in a city. If promises were made, they weren't followed later, tough luck unless the General Assembly can pass legislation de-annexing. Currently, that right of self-determination and property rights is not enjoyed by the citizens of Georgia. Whatever procedures are adopted by the General Assembly to notify the City Council of de-annexation to the legislative means, again, we would urge that they also apply to annexation and notifying the counties in the process. In short, those complete my comments. I'm going to ask Ken if you'd like to elaborate on any of the points made.
Thank you. No, members of the committee, thank you for having me. I have no comments.
Again, I want to thank you all for inviting us to participate in this process. I've given you lots of information. I tried to make it short today. You have it in front of you, and I'll be happy, Madam Chair, to avail ourselves for any questions you may have.
Thank you, Todd. At this time, we have a question from Representative Oliver.
Recommending that the county be notified of an annexation effort. Do you have a specific timetable on that, or do you have what specificity should be?
I would ask, as we always have, whatever rules, laws, regulations, or procedures apply to de-annexation also apply to annexation. So if it's in the General Assembly's determination that it should be a certified letter sent to the city, whatever time frame is proposed in that method, we would just ask the same for annexation. So we're flexible on that, but again, we want to end the double standard there, ma'am.
Are you suggesting that the notice of annexation should have a specific method?
I did not come forth suggesting that as rough as possible. I know that's often hard to do, and it may change during the process. But so long as it's mentioned and the notification goes. Again, if Ken, you want to elaborate on any of these, please do.
Well, I mean, just to the extent that in the normal annexation process that's originated out of the city, we would have a map. So there would be some sort of a demarcation of the parcels. So I mean, again, that would be helpful from a county perspective to know, in fact, whether in fact there is any concern, what in fact infrastructure is implicated, what in fact commercial property is implicated. So again, information is power, information is knowledge, and that works for governing authorities as well. So yes, ma'am, I mean, that would be helpful. I don't know if it's practical.
Chairman Reinders.
Thank you. And as it relates to the cherry picking and there really not being self-determination if you got a veto coming back out, and I appreciate that. But so I'm assuming ACCG then, to avoid that kind of specific commercial cherry picking, would be in favor of the same thing that I asked earlier of the cities, which would be any kind of annexation be done not by parcels but by census blocks. If you want to eliminate the cherry picking, wouldn't census blocks be a lot easier? Come on.
I understand. I'm not familiar with the mapping process. I'm not a GIS fella. As far as the difference between census blocks and the other procedures which were mentioned today, I do recognize that there's legitimate concern that once these boundaries are proposed, the annexation, the impacts it may have. I don't know the block procedures versus the other ones, but it might be worthy of the General Assembly, and we would support a mechanism whereby once boundaries are proposed, you could curb the annexation of those prior different city in the meantime. I mean, that's a legitimate thing to look at.
I think it's legitimate to ask if we're saying that we've got cherry picking that goes on commercial and all this, and that we really don't know the number of people on incorporation and annexation, and the only system that we have that currently doesn't use census blocks is when it comes to annexation. I would suggest that if that's a legitimate concern, not to just take one commercial property, that logic dictates that you look at the census block that we use for everything else.
I think that would be a fair approach.
So you would support that?
We don't have a position on it, but I think it's a legitimate concern, and it needs to be addressed through means similar to that, if not that. Yes, sir.
In the reverse, unless we get into a great legal discussion, which I'm lost in the woods when that happens, as it relates to something that has been already annexed and to be able to be de-annexed, if someone was promised, if you'll give me this service 6 years ago, but I still haven't gotten the service, if we went down the path of the census blocks for annexation, and you talk about the double standard, and I understand that argument, I truly do, and Todd, you know I do, then unless you've been grandfathered on a previous annexation, then I would ask you to seriously consider the reverse, which is if you're going to de-annex, it also be done by census block.
Fair enough.
I mean, because you don't want the double standard either way. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Beskins.
Thank you. Mr. Edwards, I have a question about your recommendation for the referendum process. This is on page 2 in the middle of the page, where you say the incorporation of a new city should be dependent on a county-wide vote, not just a vote within the proposed corporate boundaries. I have 3 questions about that. Whether you know, do other states have that type of statute, about how many states have that? My second question is whether you propose voting by everyone in the county or just the county residents who live in an unincorporated area. The third question would be whether ACCG has an opinion or an estimate of what % of new proposed incorporations would pass if this rule were in place in circumstances where something less than half of the people in the county that were allowed to vote, whether it's everybody in the county or just those in unincorporated areas, were voting. In other words, if you have less than half of your critical mass, how many new cities do you think would ever pass? And then if that answer is something between 0 and a small number, whether you think this rule would be fair to all the people not currently living in a city. It seems that it prefers existing cities.
Now, you may have to help me. I keep track of all the questions that were asked.
Right. I think it's an interesting proposal. I just would like to hear it fleshed out a little bit.
Do we have information on whether other states require? The states are all over the board on their rules, laws, and regulations on creating new cities. Some of them actually require the counties that are a board at the county level to approve them, some at the state. I do not have the numbers on what counties, if if they go through, or what states, if it goes through a referendum process, allow the entire county to vote. We do have 2 of our interns currently researching that, but I do not have that information. And second, I know the answer, but I forgot the question.
Whether you're talking about everyone in the county voting or just those living in currently unincorporated
Everyone in the
areas.
county, because this impacts other cities as well, ma'am. I'm not saying unincorporated versus incorporated.
I understand that. So that's going to make it even more difficult for the percent of the population in the proposed city to be a significant amount of the voting population. So although this rule may be a great idea, it seems that the effect, whether intended or not, is going to be to make it very difficult for a new city to be incorporated.
I'm not sure if that's the intention or would be the effect. However, I would maintain that the creation of a new city impacts those individuals far beyond its borders, whether they be in existing cities, neighborhoods close by, or the entire county. Thus our recommendation. On the third, what percentage would pass, I don't know. We haven't gotten there yet.
Does ACCG have an opinion or a position that it believes it would reduce or slow the pace of incorporation of new cities here in Georgia?
We don't have an opinion one way or another. Again, the impact is so broad that we do believe it's only fair that the entire citizens, both unincorporated and within existing cities, get input in the process. And I recognize up front that we've thrown a lot of recommendations out there, and we had to make that decision coming forward. It's probably not feasible. I don't think there's going to be legislative will to pass them, but given this opportunity, which we truly appreciate, I wanted to get down, what we feel. Whether this is politically feasible in the General Assembly or whether that future vote would be feasible, I don't know.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
I just want to talk the
Chairman
political
Rhodes.
feasibility real quick. If we're talking about whether it's feasible in the General Assembly and the 35% in the whole county being able to vote, piggybacking that with the comments earlier about the communication, part of the problem here is that you've got 3 county commissioners sitting over here representing this area who doesn't have anything to do with this area, and they're trying to impose their will over here. That's part of the problem. That's part of the lack of communication. So are you communicating with them that, you know what, if you don't work with these people on their zoning and you keep wanting to do this to this particular area or tax them out or not do this or not, do you tell your people if you don't keep doing that, then more of this is going to come? Are you communicating with them that that's part of the problem? Because they ain't got a dog in this fight. If they can tax them, they're going to do it. You've seen that movie. And so I don't know if that's the will of the county commission to talk to the members who don't represent, don't hurt them too bad.
We communicate extensively with our membership via our training and other meetings and seminars and the ability to get along, look out for the entire county and not specific districts. Politically,
but it's a problem,
anything
isn't it?
can happen. Well,
Right.
there's all sorts of problems politically in this state, Mr. Rogers. But I don't know. I mean, specifically, we don't per se get involved in local political matters, but as far as training them on and trying to incorporate all of those into their, running the county for the best of all citizens, that is certainly among our guiding principles at ACCG.
Thank you. I appreciate your presentation and your handout. That'll be very helpful to us. Thank you both for being here, and seeing no further questions, we'll let you go.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. And we're going to move on now to our public comment section. But I do want to remind you that we have 30 minutes left in this meeting. Please be brief in your comments. The first person we're going to call on is Ms. Linda Bryant with the Fulton County School System.
Good morning. I'm going to try to be brief.
Thank you. We do have about 6 more after you. So
Okay.
please keep
I'm
that in
Linda
mind.
Bryant, Vice President of Fulton County School Board, and the proposed annexation is in my area. Fulton County School System is in a unique position as it relates to annexation and de-annexation. First, we border the City of Atlanta and the Atlanta Public Schools, so annexation has an effect on the service area of the school system. Second, there is a current lawsuit filed by the City of Atlanta that will affect which school system Fulton students may attend. The timing of the lawsuit comes while a petition for annexation into the City of Atlanta is pending, which would affect approximately 1,700 county students and 2 school buildings. Under the current law, the Fulton County school system was not required to receive notice of this proposed annexation, nor were they offered the opportunity to provide an impact statement. This has caused substantial uncertainty and anxiety within the affected communities. The outcome of the lawsuit is uncertain, so we would request that the Georgia General Assembly intervene in order to provide certainty for the parents, students, and taxpayers who may be affected. We would request that the General Assembly place a moratorium on proposed annexation affecting large number of students of the Fulton County school system until the lawsuit is resolved and until the General Assembly has time to consider any amendments to the annexation laws which it deems necessary. Fulton County is the first large system which has chosen the charter system operating model, and its taxpayers to have spent a tremendous amount of resources to create an environment where students, parents, teachers, and interested parties have a stake in the governance and curriculum of each school. The entire process would be disrupted if these students would be sent to other schools. Annexation like the one proposed would affect the feeder patterns, disrupt students as they graduate through the school district. This will have a negative impact on student achievement. Likewise, if the school buildings are annexed into the city, the Fulton County School District would need to relocate approximately 1,500 students. There is insufficient school capacity to accomplish this without building new facilities. Not only would this be disruptive, it would be very costly to the taxpayers who have already paid for facilities for these students. We would respectfully request that the study committee consider the following policy consideration. County school systems that border independent school systems should have the opportunity to receive prior notice of any proposed annexation impacting more than 50 students and be provided ample time to analyze the impact on student facilities and budgets. They should be afforded the right to object to such annexation upon the showing of a substantial negative impact to students, facilities, and budget. In addition to the counties, the school system should be a part of the existing arbitration process. That process should also be strengthened. I have with me, our COO, Mr.
Madam Chair, is it all right to expand on Ms. Bryant's comments? I will
Please
attempt to
do,
be
and
extremely
be
brief. I just
okay.
wanted to provide a little bit more context of the situation just to make the committee aware. And I'm not sure how familiar the committee is with the pending annexation. As Ms. Bryant indicated, there's an LCA that's in place that calls into question the ownership of those school properties and as annexation occurs. So picture, if you will, an area of about 200 students that are being captured by the City of Atlanta, which has its own independent school district. That area also contains 2 schools that serve an additional 1,500 students that live in unincorporated Fulton County, Union City, and East Point. And so it leaves the district, if we were to lose those facilities, in a considerable dilemma on how to address the capacity and needs. It really would get back to providing portable capacity for those students at the next nearest school until we can address a larger discussion about overcrowding in the district. We estimate that cost to the district to be about $3 million in the first year of placing those portables, so considerable cost to the taxpayers of Fulton County schools. A redistricting, we anticipate, or changing the attendance boundaries. I'll use a different phrase than redistricting because I know it has multiple meanings. But changing those attendance boundaries, we have a very deliberate and open, transparent process we use in Fulton County to engage our communities, largely because we know the communities are at the heart, or our schools are at the heart of our communities in Fulton County. That takes several months to plan, and redistribute. As Ms. Bryant indicated, overcrowding would have to be essentially evenly distributed among existing schools. We anticipate the impact would be much greater than the 1,500 students initially stated, because as you sort of dig a hole, you have to fill a hole. And as this school lives on the border of the South Fulton area, you essentially have to touch every single school community, and then you have to look at feeder patterns and balance your enrollments. And then lastly, if we were to put in place a capital solution, It would take 4 to 7 years. We would, of course, have to go to the taxpayers, seek some sort of resolution or referendum to fund capital to meet the needs of these students, which we anticipate that cost to be, depending on the construction market today, which has been sort of interesting to watch, it could be in excess of $50 million.
Thank you. I appreciate both of your presentations, and thank you for giving us your written statement. That will be very helpful as we move forward. Thank you again. Next, I'll call on Sharon Whitmore with the Fulton County Board of Commissioners.
Representative Tankersley, since I spoke the last time, I'm going to allow Marvin Harkins from our county attorney's office to speak.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, members of the committee. My name is Marvin Harkins. I'm an attorney in the Fulton County Attorney's Office, and I want to sort of piggyback off of what the comments that Ms. Whitmore had presented to you all last time, and also off the comments from ACCG this morning as well. Basically, Fulton County is unique among the counties that ACCG represents because, for obvious reasons, we're typically the largest county in the state of Georgia in metro area. And as it's played out over the last several years, obviously there have been a large number of incorporations of cities and annexations of territory from Fulton County, so that the majority of Fulton County is actually now incorporated. And so that makes them interesting. It's almost as if the process of incorporation and annexation as it plays out over time is what's happening in Fulton County, because as cities get incorporated, new cities get incorporated, and as territory gets annexed, I think at the end of the day, you can come to a situation where it's like, okay, then what is a logical extension? What's a logical conclusion of this process? And what we're having now is we're at a point to where you have what is the impact not just on the property owners being annexed or incorporated, the cities and the counties, but also what's the impact upon the remaining citizens in the unincorporated areas, and how is the services being delivered to those folks. And so I wanted to talk about sort of some of the nuts and bolts process with the annexation process, just annexation, and some recommendations that are unique, I think, to Fulton County, just based on issues that we deal with. Obviously, there's an arbitration process, there's a dispute resolution process for annexations, but there's a limited number of bases upon which the county can object. Now, one of the issues with that is in a densely populated place like Fulton County, typically if you annex a property, it is already developed. There is a building there, there's something there. So you kind of know what the zoning will be. The issue is not so much, it's different if it were vacant land and you could just come in and redevelop that as you want to, but with a built out property, then the issue becomes, okay, there are no land use objections because it is what it is, the building is there. The issue becomes a year later when they want to redevelop it, and at that point, there is no ability for the county to weigh in at that point. So the Fulton County would respectfully suggest that the bases for objecting be expanded. One of the examples is that, and I think there was an issue about presenting a map or presenting information with the annexation petition. Sometimes you won't be able to tell if you have a valid objection because you don't have enough information that's being presented. Knowledge is power, as Mr. Gerard said earlier, and so the more information that the counties can have at the outset, the better. One of the issues that's played out in our county is the issue of contiguity. As y'all know, you have issues, you have to make sure that there's a certain amount of the boundary that joins the city, but if you don't have adequate information, it's kind of difficult to tell, frankly, if there's a contiguity issue. But then again, contiguity is not something that's a valid basis for objection under the existing law. Board of Education was here, they spoke. Obviously, there's an issue that's playing out in Fulton County regarding an annexation that affects them. That's not so much a county issue, obviously, but as y'all know, elected officials, people call y'all. If it's federal, state, y'all get calls, and so that's something that we find is important, and hope that y'all will look at in terms of letting in those unique instances where you have multiple boards of education in one county. I think that's something that's not contemplated by existing state law, and so hopefully y'all would look at that. Regarding de-annexation, echo the comments from ACCG just in terms of making the process the same for both. And that does, to the extent that a county is a stakeholder, the property owner is a stakeholder, the city is a stakeholder, give the property owners their right to be where they want to be. Sort of a very specific issue that we would have is regarding the resolution referendum method of annexation. There was two gentlemen here, I think, that spoke last time at the last meeting. I think there was one gentleman with a very large cowboy hat, so maybe he stands out. I think the DeKalb County residents. And the issue there is for commercial property owners under the resolution and referendum method, it's the only people that get to vote in that referendum are actually residential property owners as opposed to commercial. Obviously, commercial property owners are the most desirable because they added the tax base, but under that particular method, they don't have a say in that referendum. So we would ask that they be given a voice at the table. So appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your presentation. Next, we would call on Representative Roger Bruce for some brief comments. That'd be fine.
Good morning, Madam Chair and members of the committee. As you all know, this is kind of personal for me as being the author of the bill to allow the folks in South Fulton an opportunity to decide what their future is going to be. And thank you for your help, and Mr. Chairman, for your help in getting the bill out of the House twice. And I think it drives home the point. We got it out of the House twice, got it over to the Senate, and both times it was stopped by people who had absolutely nothing to do with the city and don't live in the city, the proposed city, excuse me. And it became just a political ball over there being bounced around. But I think part of the problem is that there's confusion, because the bill technically is a local bill being treated as a general bill. And on the House side, on the Senate side, they're treating it like a local bill, and it's creating huge amounts of confusion. So, if it's a way, and I don't know what the way is, but if there's a way to either make it a local bill or make it a general bill on both sides, so that everybody knows what the rules are and how we're playing this game. Right now, it is totally confusing. And those of us that were here, back, with Sandy Springs, we know what was going on, why it happened, all other stuff. And my suggestion would be to just take it back to the way it was. I mean, we can't undo what has happened, but if it's a local bill, and it should be, let it be a local bill and move on. And half of the things that we're discussing right now would go away if we did that. So that's one piece of it. The other thing that's causing some confusion in this 60% method is who gets to validate the signatures. And that's a big issue, because right now it appears that the city that wants to annex the area in gets to validate the signatures, and that's a conflict of interest to me, because that you may not have it. You may not have the signatures, but if you really want the area, you're going to say, yeah, I got it. And there's no process in place to challenge that. So it needs to be some clarity around who gets to validate it. In the instances for South Fulton right now, I know that there have been at least 3 different groups that have looked at the signatures that were presented. And all 3 of those groups have said that the signatures are insufficient and are not enough to move forward. But the city still has the petitions, and they have not provided anything. So you have teachers, who are, trying to figure out what's going on. Their minds are not on teaching the children. Their minds are on whether they're going to have a job or not. And so we need to get some clarity around that. And I don't know if we could legally do this or not, but I know we've done some other stuff and tried to see whether it would fly or not. But yeah, as a suggestion, once the bill for to provide a person the voters an opportunity to vote, once it passes either chamber, I think at that point the map should be frozen. And it should be frozen because it is clear that at least, there's interest in making sure that there's an opportunity for people to vote on these city referendums. And if we don't freeze that map at some point, then we're going to be repeating ourselves over and over and over and over again, and we're going to at some point make a big mistake if we allow one of these cities to in fact incorporate, but everything has changed since they did their study, and now they can't sustain themselves. So we need to freeze that map, and I'm going to ask our legal counsel over there at some point to see whether we could do that. Freeze the map once it passes either body in the legislature. And the question about who gets to vote. We have, in my area, these schools that they're talking about, I can walk to them. Both my kids went to these schools. And the schools are going to be impacted no matter how this plays out. But the school system has not had an opportunity to weigh in on it at all. And they're going to be put in a situation where they're going to have to be playing catch up to try to accommodate whatever happens to these kids. And, for me, that is the biggest issue in this whole discussion, because we're not only talking about the 200 kids that might end up in Atlanta or the 1,500 kids that might, go, outside of that. You're talking about the entire school system on the south side being impacted, because now you have overcrowded schools, you have, uncertainty, and it affects these children not just now, but it affects them for the rest of their life if their education is interrupted. So we're talking about really impacting generations of children over a long period of time if we don't look at this and look at it correctly. With me is Deborah Bazemore. She's with one of the community organizations, and she's on the list too, so we just figured we talk at the same time and save a little time, if that's okay.
We have a few more, so please.
I'm going to be very brief,
okay,
hopefully.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Committee, for allowing me to speak. My name is Deborah Bazemore, and I'm the chair for South Fulton United, and we've been working on this effort for at least 3 years, not considering 05. Our concerns, and I've heard some of them today from you all, is that we are already operating as a city. However, we have 7 commissioners that govern us, and only 1 lives in the footprint of unincorporated South Fulton. But they dictate to us what occurs in our community. So we are unique in that, not from all the others that are proposing to become a city. We have all the revenue. We have all of everything we stand in need of right now to stand up as a city. We're just asking you all to allow us the opportunity to vote to become a city, not to create a city. Just give us the right to vote, as others have had that right. And also, the reaction to us trying to become a city, proposing to become a city, is that Chat Hills, I think I heard Representative Reiner say, reaction from individuals that want to stop the proposal going forward. Chat Hills recently, they came and they asked for approximately 7,500 acres from unincorporated South Fulton, and they were successful in annexing because there were only a few of them, and they took that amount of land. We've had College Park come and annex portions. People are picking us apart right now. We have approximately 100,000 people. We have had over 100 meetings to inform them. We have people that are ready to vote on this issue. We educate them so that they can make the decision, but we're asking you all to give us that right. Also, I propose that the cities that want the annexed areas to come in, have them give you a feasibility study. And the reason I say that is because when I say we have 100,000 people, it has been proven that portions of areas that have been annexed into Atlanta, they're not able to provide services, all the services. Unincorporated Fulton County provides services for their area. They're paying us to provide services. So, and yes, one house that's in that area is the mayor of Atlanta. So if his house was to burn today, unincorporated South Fulton Services, fire, would come to his house and put his house out, put the fire out for him. So why are we required to give a feasibility study, which we've done, and then with all the conversation I've heard, may have to do it again, and we are just common citizens, when the cities that are trying to take and pick us apart, they're not required to do anything. They're not required to show that they can provide services. And it's been proven that they can't always do that, especially with 100,000 people. Where are 100,000 people going? And then if you leave, I like the analogy that Representative Bruce has given several times. If you have a household and you have 5 individuals in that household, and they are all sharing the responsibilities of all the finance, all the bills that are in that household, and 3 of those are moved out, the bills don't change. You still have to meet those bills. You only have 2 people now, but they have to take care of everything. So as we get picked apart, we will not be able to handle what is going to be required for our services, the financial responsibility. We're not going to be able to do that. So I just ask, please again, allow us the right to vote. And if it's turned down, I say, then let each area put forth annexation petitions, but give us that right again.
Thank you. I appreciate your presentation. Thank you, Representative Bruce. Next, we have Jason Lowry and Bernard Knight with Stonecrest City Alliance. If you, that would be fine, and I'm going to ask you to both be very brief. Okay, we're down to 10 minutes.
Thank you. I am Bernard Knight. I spoke to you all last time. I'm an attorney for the Kelly Land Company, which created and still holds extensive holdings in Lithonia Industrial Park. The Kelly family and myself, we are enthusiastic members of the Stonecrest City Alliance, trying to create the city of Stonecrest. And I am an advisor to the board, and Mr. Jason Larry, the chairman, is with me here today. The first thing I want to say is I want to thank and heap a lot of praise upon Ms. Gina Wright and the Reapportionment Office. They have worked with us diligently on the creation of our map. And I think our map, among the current city maps over the last 2 or 3 years, is perhaps the least controversial. Early on, Mr. Jason Larry worked a compromise with the proposed city of Greenhaven. They agreed on a border. They got that agreement to the then chair of the House Governmental Affairs Committee early on, and it's been cemented in place ever since. So there is no controversy over the border of the city of Stonecrest. You all got maps last time from Mr. Larry. That map and those boundaries are designed to do 3 things, actually 4. One is to take in all of Lithonia Industrial Park. Second, to take in Arabia Mountain National Heritage Area. Third, to take in the Stonecrest Regional Center, which is also part of the Stonecrest overlay. And of course, the residents, 50,000 residents approximately. And that, I think we have managed not to split neighborhoods in half, and I don't know of any controversy in that regard. I want to briefly address the points which have been raised today, and I think at the last meeting, about 3 issues. Number 1, city light. As I said last time, and by the way, I was glad to see Mr. Ken Gerard, the Forsyth County Attorney, with whom I have had communications about this. And I have sent to Mr. Leo Chansey and to Mr. Lanier copies of the emails that I exchanged with Mr. Gerard at the time, in which he agrees with us that the proposed city of Stonecrest does not have the sort of restriction in its charter which would classify it as city light, which would subject it possibly to the type of constitutional challenge which is being mentioned here. In contrast, Peachtree Corners and the proposed city of Sharon Springs would. City of La Vista Hills also does not have the restriction. That's no accident, since the same council for La Vista Hills and for Stonecrest drafted that charter, and it draws upon the GMA model code, is my understanding. It does not have that restriction. We are not city light. One thing that has not been mentioned to this committee is that last year, possibly earlier this year, there was a DeKalb County Operations Task Force. I think that has been mentioned. What has not been discussed is the fact that the Operations Task Force hired an expert from Georgia Tech. And I believe he's the same expert who is currently working for the Forsyth County Commission to study the impact of the proposed city of Sharon Springs upon the rest of Forsyth County. Well, this gentleman did the same thing for DeKalb County with respect to Stonecrest. And the answer he came back with is that Stonecrest its creation will have a negligible impact on the rest of the county. It will be a wash. Now, it's not true with some of the other cities. It is true with Stonecrest. That conclusion was in writing. It was distributed at a public meeting of the Operations Task Force. I don't believe it's been posted online. I can provide it to this committee. The third thing I wanted to address is that we are cognizant of House Bill 477, and we are confident that we will be able to bring Stonecrest in compliance with the requirements of that bill. I don't think that's going to be an issue for us. In conclusion, before I turn this over to Mr. Larry, I want to briefly say that our main concern coming into these hearings was that any new restrictions, rules, procedural requirements that are created as a result of these hearings, please not be applied to the city of Stonecrest. We are in our third year of our efforts to create this city. We have a favorable feasibility study. Our bill passed the Senate earlier this year with just one dissenting vote. We're currently in Mr. Reinder's committee. We anticipate that we will have otherwise success in moving it through the General Assembly at the coming session. And we don't believe really that it would be equitable for any new restrictions to be applied to our effort. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Lowry.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Chair members, and I'll be brief. The magic question is this, committee. What happens when your county lets you down? What happens when your county that you live in not developed economically what's supposed to happen for your territory? There's trash all over the place. People are being, quite frankly, incarcerated. Some other things that are happening with regards to your management body of your county. What are you supposed to do as a citizen at that point? Wait until it's their next time again to see if they can get it right? I don't think so. This is why that at this point we're trying to be self-managed, self-proposed, self-governed on our own, because we can take care of ourselves. And I'm going to share a secret with you a little later here in about 30 seconds that Representative Tom Taylor knows this secret, and I've shared this secret with Chairman Reinders. But I'll tell you that in about 30 seconds. But here's where we are today. One is that we are a city that's proposed of 50,000 people. Not 400,000, 50,000 people in a certain corridor that has its own industrial park, that has its own commercial body, that has its own piece with regards to the residential. And in our third year, we are at 90% approval rating between business, industry, and residential to be able to be self-governed. So what we want is what everybody else has been talking about for the same thing, the opportunity for folks to vote to say yes or no. And then I can live with the results from that standpoint. Here's some underlying things, Madam Chair. If you're out of town, you may not have heard this, and if you will be so bold as allow me to be so bold, is that here's the rumors and things that happen. Oh, no. You can't do that. See, Central and North DeKalb, they're trying to hold back the other people. They're trying to make sure that the other black leaders don't get their chance so that they can't do these particular things. Well, here's a secret I'm going to share with you. I'm black, and I don't want them in charge. I want to be in charge of my own future with the people that are in our area. So there are no black cities. There are no white cities. There are cities, and then you live where you live. We just happen to live in this area. So my compelling statement to you all as the committee, let us have an opportunity this year to have folks say yes or no in this area, because we can carry our own weight, our own bucket, and our own water. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Lowry, and thank you, Mr. Knight. Our last person on the public sign-up sheet is Ed Williams with Citizens Against Cityhood in DeKalb.
Good morning, and thank you, Madam Committee Chair and the committee. This is personal for me also. I heard Representative Bruce say that. This is personal for me. I live in DeKalb County. I want to make a couple of points. One is that cities are being used in a way to segregate us by race and class, and we are not looking at the unintended consequences of that. That's one of the hidden, talked about consequences. The other point I wanted to make is that it seems that the boundary issues have not been resolved in Stonecrest, Greenhaven, La Vista Hills, Tucker, because if they had been, we would not be talking about the issues and the lack of the cities wanting to be de-annexed and annexed into other areas if the boundaries had been worked out. So obviously they have not been. The supporters in South DeKalb are using the deception to try to convince the citizens or residents in South DeKalb to support cityhood by saying that they will be left with paying the pensions of DeKalb County. That is not true. In fact, they're going around saying if we don't become a city, we'll be the only people in DeKalb County that have to pay the pension. That is remarkably deceptive, and should be someone on the committee or the assembly should say something about that. That is bold-faced untruth. The next thing I want to talk about is there has to be something done to require the differences in what is said in the services of the charter and what is actually in the CBI studies. As talked about earlier, there are some differences in the Tucker charter and the number of services that the charter says it's going to provide and the number of stipulations that were provided in the CBI study for Tucker and also for Greenhaven. That has to be resolved because the citizens think that they're only going to be providing 3 services, where I'm hearing from the people that are speaking that they are going to be responsible for all 16 services. So that should be clarified. The next point I want to make is that if we come up with new recommendations and new policies, those should apply moving forward to any city that becomes a city, new city that becomes a city. I understand this, the need to want to be fair, but when you know that you have wrong policies in place and you correct those policies, then you should apply to those policies to any city that comes into existing moving forward. Let me move rapidly close to the last comments.
You would also have the opportunity to still submit written
Yes,
statements.
I'm almost finished.
Okay.
The other thing I want to say is that the Carl Vinson Institute and the UGA and the Georgia State Andrew Young Center should have some common standards in their reporting. If you read the 2-year reports from the 2 different centers, they report the information differently. It's hard to compare the information. The other thing I want to say is that the deliberation, I appreciate the fact that you all are actually deliberating and talking about the issues, because really the people back in our communities are really concerned about this, and this is very important. So I appreciate the fact that you all are actually spending time and thinking about what you all are doing, because this impacts a whole lot of people's lives. And the last thing I want to say, Greenhaven, where I stay and live in South DeKalb, would become the 2nd largest city in the state. Most cities throughout their history grow to that size. I don't think that there are any city in the state of Georgia that overnight became 300,000 people. That has a serious impact on the county and the citizens within that boundary. So you should take serious deliberation and consideration in creating a city of 300,000 people, becoming the 2nd largest city in the state of Georgia overnight. They won't have any time to grow into making sure they can provide the services, and also making sure that the communities that are within that boundary want to be in that city. That is a serious consideration that needs to be undertaken by this committee. Thank you very much for the time.
Thank you.
Real quick, you mentioned someone gave testimony on La Vista Hills and Tucker having to provide the 16 services.
I mentioned about City Light and that fact.
No, you just mentioned that the perception out there that they had to provide all 16 services, and that was the part of the testimony.
The Green Haven and
if you'd be just kind enough to get me who said that and write it down, you can email me with the other email.
Yes.
On who said that, and if you'll give me each one of those 16 services as well.
I certainly will. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chairman Reinders. Okay, we have now completed our third meeting, and let me just stress once again that I'm really proud of the work that we've done here. Appreciate all the presenters, the staff, and just everyone that has been so faithful to take part in the study committee. Now, some more work is left for us to do, and this committee will carefully review all the testimony, the issues that we've heard, the recommendations from the various presenters before submitting our final report, and that final report will be submitted December the 1st. Thank you, and we are dismissed.